The room was dimly lit, with the faint glow of a phone screen casting shadows across the woman's face. Her trembling fingers scrolled through old photos, memories frozen in time, smiling vacations, cozy dinners, the simple joy of holding hands on the couch. Her eyes, red and swollen from crying, blurred as she stared at the image of her ex-husband holding her close, both of them laughing like they had the world figured out. That laughter felt distant now, buried beneath the weight of her regrets. She wiped away a tear with the sleeve of her sweatshirt, but the tears kept coming, as if they were determined to remind her of everything she had lost. Her heart pounded in her chest, not from anger or betrayal, but from the realization of her own choices. It wasn't supposed to end like this. She thought leaving him would be the start of something new, something exciting. Back then, it had seemed like the perfect solution. She wanted passion, adventure, and attention, things she felt had disappeared after years of marriage. She blamed her husband for it. He had become too focused on work, always chasing the next goal, coming home tired and distracted. Dinners turned quiet, conversations became predictable, and affection faded into routine gestures. She convinced herself she deserved more, that she was wasting her life waiting for him to change. The arguments between them were never loud, but the silence afterward was deafening. He would apologize for coming home late and she would smile, pretending everything was fine, while resentment slowly built like a storm inside her. She didn't even realize when the resentment turned into distance. It was as if one day she woke up and no longer felt the warmth she once had when he held her. Her heart wasn't aching, it was numb. That numbness, she thought, was the sign that their love had run its course. But she had been wrong, and now she knew it too late. Her thoughts circled back to the day she met the man who would change everything. He was charming, smooth, and knew exactly what to say. From the moment he complimented her smile, she felt something stir inside her that she hadn't felt in years. He made her feel seen, important, like she was the most desirable woman in the room. The attention was addictive, like a drug she didn't know she was craving. He listened when she complained about her marriage and reassured her that she deserved someone who would worship her. She believed him. When he invited her to dinner, she didn't hesitate. One dinner turned into weekends away, secret getaways that made her feel alive again. She felt reborn, convinced that this was the love she had been missing. Her husband had noticed the change in her. He wasn't blind to the way she avoided his touch or how she no longer smiled when he walked through the door. He asked her if she was happy, and she lied, saying she just needed space to figure things out. But the truth was that she had already made up her mind. The day she handed him the divorce papers, he didn't yell or fight. He just looked at her with the saddest eyes she had ever seen and said, "I don't understand what I did wrong, but I hope you find what you're looking for." His words lingered, but she brushed them off, thinking they were nothing more than a guilt trip. She walked out of their home, believing she was walking toward happiness. Instead, she was walking straight into a trap she couldn't see yet. Now, sitting alone, she realized the weight of those words. Her husband hadn't tried to stop her, but that didn't mean he didn't care. She saw the truth in those tear-streaked photographs. The man who had loved her, flaws and all, had been the one she abandoned. And now, the man she had chosen was nowhere to be found. The first few weeks after the divorce had been a whirlwind. She had felt free, liberated, like a bird finally escaping a cage. The other man, Daniel, had swept her away into a life she had only dreamed of. Fancy dinners at upscale restaurants, weekend getaways in luxury resorts, surprise gifts arriving at her doorstep wrapped in ribbons. It was everything she thought she wanted. She posted photos online showing off the highlights of her new life, making sure the world saw her smile and the glamorous places she visited. but deep down, something felt off. The thrill of it all came too fast, and her smiles faded the moment she put her phone down. When the cameras weren't rolling, her heart remained uneasy. At first, she thought it was just the guilt of leaving her husband. Maybe it would pass, she told herself. It had to. Daniel was offering her the world. Why wasn't she happy? But as the days passed, the cracks in her new life started to show. He wasn't the man she thought he was. The sweet, attentive man who had listened to her every word when they were sneaking around now seemed distant. Their conversations felt shallow, and he barely asked how her day went. The romantic gestures she had loved so much were becoming fewer, replaced by late nights where he barely looked up from his phone. When she asked him about it, he would brush her off with a casual, "Just work stuff. Don't worry about it." But she did worry. She noticed the subtle changes in his tone, how he no longer complimented her or made her feel special. There were nights when he didn't come home, claiming he had last-minute business meetings or that he was staying over at a friend's place. The explanation sounded believable at first, but her gut told her otherwise. She pushed the doubts away, trying to convince herself she was just overthinking. After all, she'd given up everything for this man. She couldn't afford to be wrong about him. Then came the nights when she lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering why she felt lonelier now than she ever did when she was married. With her ex-husband, even during the worst of times, there had been a quiet comfort in knowing he was there. She could feel the warmth of him next to her, even if they weren't speaking. But here, in this new life, she felt cold and empty. Daniel slept on the other side of the bed, facing away from her, as though there was a wall between them that she couldn't break through. Her mind raced with questions she didn't want to ask, and memories she had tried to forget crept in. One night, as she scrolled through social media, she came across a post from her ex-husband. It wasn't much, just a photo of him at a small cafe, a cup of coffee on the table, but it was the caption that made her chest tighten. Sometimes the quiet moments are the loudest. Her fingers hovered over the screen, tempted to leave a comment or send a message. But what would she say? That she missed him? That she realized she had made a mistake? She put the phone down and buried her face in her hands, the weight of her decision pressing down harder than ever before. For the first time, she admitted to herself that she wasn't living the dream she had imagined. She had traded stability for excitement, and now that excitement was fading fast. The next morning, she tried to talk to Daniel, hoping to reconnect and ease the doubts gnawing at her. "Do you still love me?" she asked softly, her voice barely above a whisper. He looked up from his phone, confused, as if the question had come out of nowhere. "Why would you even ask that?" he replied, laughing like it was a joke. But it wasn't a joke to her. It was the question that had kept her awake for nights on end. When he didn't answer and simply went back to scrolling through his messages, she felt the knot in her stomach tighten. The silence between them grew louder, suffocating her. As she sat there at the kitchen table, staring at the man she thought was her future, she couldn't help but wonder what her ex-husband was doing at that very moment. Was he still thinking about her? Or had he already moved on? The thought of him finding someone else was unbearable, but so was the thought of staying trapped in a life where she felt like nothing more than an afterthought. She needed to know if there was a way back to what she had lost. The days dragged on, each one blending into the next as she tried to ignore the growing distance between her and Daniel. His late nights became more frequent, and his excuses became thinner. The warmth she once felt from him had been replaced by a cold, empty void. She told herself to be patient, that every relationship had its ups and downs. But deep down, she knew that this wasn't just a phase. This was the unraveling of everything she had built her hopes on. The same charm that had lured her in was now being used to keep her at arm's length, and she hated how powerless she felt. One evening, she decided she couldn't take it anymore. She followed her instincts, which had been screaming at her for weeks, and checked Daniel's phone while he was in the shower. Her hands trembled as she unlocked the screen. At first, there was nothing unusual. Work emails, random messages from friends. But then, buried in a messaging app, she found a string of texts that shattered the fragile hope she had been clinging to. There were messages from another woman, filled with flirty emojis, late-night confessions, and plans for secret meetups. Her heart pounded in her chest as she scrolled through them, her breath hitching with each new message she read. One particular message burned itself into her memory. "I miss last night already. Can't wait to see you again." It was dated just 2 days ago, on a night when Daniel had told her he was working late. She felt the room spin, her vision blurring as she tried to process what she had just seen. The betrayal cut deeper than she had expected, and for a moment she couldn't breathe. She had left her husband, her stable, loving husband, for this? For a man who had been lying to her all along? The weight of her mistake crushed her, and she sank to the floor, clutching the phone as tears streamed down her face. When Daniel walked back into the room, he noticed her sitting there, broken and defeated. "What's wrong?" he asked, but there was no genuine concern in his voice. She looked up at him, her face drenched in tears, and threw the phone onto the table. "You lied to me," she whispered, her voice cracking. For a moment he hesitated, then sighed, as if her pain was nothing more than an inconvenience. "You shouldn't have gone through my phone," he replied, his tone cold and dismissive. There was no apology, no explanation, just a shrug, as if his betrayal was something she should have expected. The reality of the situation hit her like a tidal wave. This man, the one she had risked everything for, didn't care. He never had. She had been a temporary thrill, a conquest to be won and discarded when the excitement wore off. She thought back to her ex-husband, to the way he had held her when she cried, the way he had always been there, even when she had pushed him away. She remembered the sadness in his eyes when she left, and suddenly she understood the depth of that sadness. He hadn't been sad because he was losing her. He had been sad because he knew she was making a mistake she would regret. Standing up, she wiped her tears and looked at Daniel one last time. "I gave up everything for you," she said, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. "And you gave me nothing." Without waiting for a response, she grabbed her coat and walked out the door. The night air was cold, but it felt better than the suffocating atmosphere she had just left behind. As she walked aimlessly through the streets, her mind raced with thoughts of her ex-husband. Was it too late to go back? Did he hate her for what she had done? Or had he already moved on, leaving her to face the consequences of her choices alone? She didn't know the answers, but one thing was clear. She couldn't stay where she was. The night felt endless as she wandered through the quiet streets, her breath visible in the cold air. She hugged her coat tighter around her, but it couldn't protect her from the chill that came from within. Her mind wouldn't stop replaying every moment that had led her here, every decision that had pushed her further away from the one person who had truly loved her. She had believed she was escaping loneliness, but the irony of it was suffocating. She had never felt lonelier in her life. Eventually, her feet carried her to the park, where she and her ex-husband used to take morning walks. The memories hit her like a flood. She could almost hear his voice, softly teasing her about how she always needed coffee before starting the day. They had shared so many moments here, simple, quiet moments that she had once taken for granted. Back then, she had thought those mornings were boring, repetitive. Now, she craved that kind of peace, the kind that came from knowing you were with someone who didn't need to impress you to keep you happy. Tears welled in her eyes again as she sat down on a bench, her fingers numb from the cold. As she sat there, she did something she hadn't done in months. She opened her phone and scrolled through her ex-husband's social media profile. His posts were simple, nothing flashy, but each one felt like a punch to her chest. There was a photo of him smiling at a family gathering, surrounded by people who had always welcomed her as one of their own. She had lost more than just him when she walked away. She had lost the home they had built together, the people who had embraced her, the life that had once felt so secure. Then she saw the post that made her heart stop. It was a picture of him standing in front of a small cafe, holding a cup of coffee, the same one she'd seen earlier, but this time she noticed something she had missed before, another hand in the frame resting lightly on his arm. It wasn't his hand. Her breath hitched as she zoomed in, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. The hand belonged to a woman. Her fingers were delicate, manicured, and they rested on him in a way that felt too familiar. The caption beneath the photo was simple: grateful for new beginnings. The night felt endless as she wandered through the quiet streets, her breath visible in the cold air. She hugged her coat tighter around her, but it couldn't protect her from the chill that came from within. Her mind wouldn't stop replaying every moment that had led her here, every decision that had pushed her further away from the one person who had truly loved her. She had believed she was escaping loneliness, but the irony of it was suffocating. She had never felt lonelier in her life. Eventually, her feet carried her to the park where she and her ex-husband used to take morning walks. The memories hit her like a flood. She could almost hear his voice, softly teasing her about how she always needed coffee before starting the day. They had shared so many moments here, simple, quiet moments that she had once taken for granted. Back then, she'd thought those mornings were boring, repetitive. Now, she craved that kind of peace, the kind that came from knowing you were with someone who didn't need to impress you to keep you happy. Tears welled in her eyes again as she sat down on a bench, her fingers numb from the cold. As she sat there, she did something she hadn't done in months. She opened her phone and scrolled through her ex-husband's social media profile. His posts were simple, nothing flashy, but each one felt like a punch to her chest. There was a photo of him, smiling at a family gathering, surrounded by people who had always welcomed her as one of their own. She had lost more than just him when she walked away. She had lost the home they had built together, the people who had embraced her, the life that had once felt so secure. Then she saw the post that made her heart stop. It was a picture of him standing in front of a small cafe, holding a cup of coffee, the same one she had seen earlier, but this time she noticed something she had missed before, another hand in the frame, resting lightly on his arm. It wasn't his hand. Her breath hitched as she zoomed in, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. The hand belonged to a woman. Her fingers were delicate, manicured, and they rested on him in a way that felt too familiar. The caption beneath the photo was simple: grateful for new beginnings. Her heart sank as the reality set in. He had moved on. Of course, he had. What else was he supposed to do after she had left him behind? She stared at the screen, her mind racing with questions she had no answers to. Who was she? How long had they been together? Was he happier with her than he had been with her? The thought twisted like a knife in her chest. She tried to tell herself that she had no right to feel this way, that she had made her choice and this was the price she had to pay. But logic didn't stop the pain. Her fingers hovered over the screen, tempted to send him a message. She wanted to say something, anything. But what could she say? "I'm sorry" didn't feel like enough. "I miss you" felt selfish. She put the phone down, her hands trembling. She hadn't just lost him. She had lost the version of herself that had been whole, loved, and secure. And now she was nothing more than a woman sitting on a park bench, haunted by the choices she couldn't take back. The cold wind blew through her hair, but she didn't move. She couldn't. Part of her wanted to go to him, to beg for forgiveness. But what if it was too late? What if he had found the happiness she had been too blind to see? The thought paralyzed her. Her chest tightened, and she wrapped her arms around herself, as if holding herself together was the only thing keeping her from falling apart completely. Her tears fell silently, blending into the darkness of the night. For the first time, she realized that regret wasn't just a feeling, it was a prison, and she had locked herself inside it. The night dragged on, but she didn't know how long she had been sitting there, trapped in her own thoughts. Her tears had dried, but the weight of everything still pressed down on her. The distant sound of cars and the rustling of leaves filled the silence around her, but none of it registered. She kept thinking about that photo, the hand resting on his arm, the new woman who now had the place in his life that she had once taken for granted. Her mind wouldn't let her rest. It painted vivid pictures of him laughing with this woman, sharing inside jokes, making memories that no longer involved her. Was she better for him? Did she give him the happiness she couldn't? The questions clawed at her, making her chest ache. Suddenly, her phone buzzed in her lap, pulling her out of the spiral. She looked down, hoping for something, anything, that would take her mind off the torture she'd been putting herself through. But it was just a notification from a random app, something meaningless. She sighed and leaned back against the bench, closing her eyes and breathing in the cold night air. For a moment, she considered going back to Daniel's apartment, if only to grab her things and leave for good. But the thought of returning to that empty place, where love had never really existed, made her stomach turn. She stood up, her legs stiff and shaky, and began walking without a clear destination. Her fingers brushed over her phone in her pocket, tempted to dial his number. What would she even say if he picked up? Could she admit that she had made the biggest mistake of her life? Would he even listen to her, or had he closed that chapter for good? As she walked, the memories of their last conversation played in her mind, the way he had quietly accepted her decision, even though it had broken him. She had expected anger, maybe even a fight, but he had given her none of that. Instead, he had let her go with grace, and that was what hurt the most. He had loved her enough to let her leave, even when it tore him apart. Her phone vibrated again, and this time it wasn't a notification. It was a message. Her heart raced as she pulled the phone from her pocket, hoping, praying that it would be him. But it wasn't. It was Daniel. "Where are you?" The message was short, cold, and without emotion. She stared at it for a moment before locking the screen and shoving the phone back into her pocket. She didn't want to talk to him. There was nothing left to say. Her feet carried her to a familiar place before she even realized where she was going. His street. The house she had once called home was just ahead, its warm lights glowing softly in the distance. Her breath hitched at the sight of it. Nothing had changed. The same flowers she had planted lined the walkway, and the wind chimes she had picked out on a whim still hung by the porch, swaying gently in the breeze. It felt like she had stepped back in time, to a life that now felt like a distant dream. She stopped in front of the house, her fingers tightening around the strap of her bag. Through the window, she could see the faint glow of the living room light. Was he home? Was he sitting on the couch, reading one of the books he loved? Or was he with her, this new woman who had replaced her so effortlessly? The thought made her chest tighten again, but she couldn't walk away. Not yet. She needed closure, or maybe she just needed a sign that it wasn't truly over. She took a step forward, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure it would echo through the quiet street. Just as she reached the porch, the door opened. Her breath caught in her throat as he stepped outside, his gaze meeting hers. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The world around them seemed to fall away, leaving only the weight of their shared history hanging in the air between them. His expression was unreadable, but there was no anger in his eyes, no resentment, just quiet surprise. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. What could she say that wouldn't sound pathetic or selfish? Her lips trembled, and she felt tears welling up again. Finally, he broke the silence. "Why are you here?" His voice was calm, but there was something guarded about it, as if he was bracing himself for whatever she was about to say. She swallowed hard, her throat dry and tight. I didn't know where else to go," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. The vulnerability in her words made her feel exposed, but she couldn't stop herself. "I made a mistake," she added, her eyes pleading with him to understand. He stood there for a moment, his expression softening slightly. "It's late," he said quietly. "You should come inside." She nodded, unable to trust herself to speak without breaking down completely. As she followed him through the door, the warmth of the house enveloped her, but it did little to ease the storm inside her. This wasn't how she had imagined things going. She thought she would be stronger, more composed. But now, standing here in the home they had shared, all she could feel was the crushing weight of regret. As she stepped inside, the familiar scent of the house wrapped around her like a forgotten embrace. Faint traces of his cologne mixed with the warm, comforting smell of wood and old books. Her eyes darted around, taking in the little things that hadn't changed. The coat rack by the door, the framed photo of them from their first anniversary still sitting on the entryway table. It was like time had frozen here, but she hadn't. She had walked out and lived a different life, and yet this place felt like home, in a way that Daniel's apartment never had. He gestured toward the living room, where the soft glow of a lamp cast warm shadows across the walls. She sat on the edge of the couch, her fingers nervously twisting the strap of her bag. He sat across from her in the armchair, leaning forward slightly, his elbows resting on his knees. The silence between them was thick, but he didn't rush to fill it. He waited, giving her space, just like he always had. She had once taken that patience for granted, but now it was the only thing keeping her from falling apart. Her eyes flickered to the book on the coffee table, a worn hardcover with a dog-eared page marking his spot. It was one of his favourites, a book she had once teased him about, rereading over and over. The memory hit her unexpectedly, and she felt her throat tighten. "You're still reading this?" she asked, her voice barely steady. He glanced at the book, then back at her. "Some things are worth revisiting," he said simply, and she wasn't sure if he was talking about the book or something else entirely. The double meaning hung in the air, making her heart race. She wanted to believe that this was her chance, that maybe he hadn't completely let go of what they once had. But she knew it wouldn't be that easy. It couldn't be. "I don't know where to start," she admitted, her fingers tightening around the fabric of her bag. "There's so much I want to say, but none of it feels like enough." He leaned back slightly, his gaze steady but unreadable. "Why don't you start with the truth?" His words weren't harsh, but they cut through her defenses effortlessly. She felt the tears building again and blinked rapidly, trying to keep them at bay. "I thought I was missing something," she said, her voice cracking. "I thought the excitement, the attention, everything Daniel gave me was what I needed. I thought I wasn't happy because we had lost that spark, and I blamed you for it. But I see now that it wasn't you. It was me. I was chasing something that wasn't real." Her breath hitched and she looked down at her hands, ashamed of how broken she sounded. He didn't interrupt, didn't offer any comforting words. He just let her speak, and somehow that made it easier to keep going. "Daniel wasn't who I thought he was," she continued. "He lied to me, cheated on me, and made me feel like I was nothing. But the worst part is that I let him. I walked away from the one person who truly cared about me, and I didn't see it until it was too late." Her tears spilled over and she wiped them away quickly, embarrassed by her own vulnerability. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I needed you to know that I understand now. I understand everything you tried to give me, and I was too blind to see it." The room fell silent again, but this time it wasn't suffocating. It was heavy, but there was a strange comfort in it, as if the weight of her confession had lifted something between them. She didn't dare look up, afraid of what she might see in his eyes. Would it be anger, disappointment, or worse, indifference? But when he finally spoke, his voice was gentle. "I loved you," he said softly, and her heart shattered all over again. The past tense of his words felt like a dagger to her chest, but she forced herself to keep listening. "I loved you in a way I didn't think I could love anyone. That's why I let you go. I didn't want to hold you back from whatever you thought you were missing." Tears streamed down her face, but she didn't wipe them away this time. "And now?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Do you still—" He exhaled, leaning back in his chair as he ran a hand through his hair. "I don't know," he admitted, and the honesty in his voice made her stomach twist. "You hurt me, and as much as I want to forget that, it's not easy." She nodded, her chest aching. She had known it wouldn't be simple, but hearing him say it still crushed her. "I understand," she said quietly. "I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I had to try." He stood up, walking toward the window and looking out into the night. She watched him, her heart in her throat, waiting for him to say something, anything that would give her a sliver of hope. Finally, he turned back to her, his eyes softer now, as if he could see how much pain she was in. "I don't know if we can go back to what we were," he said, "but maybe we can start somewhere new." His words weren't a promise, but they were more than she had hoped for. A chance. That's all she needed. Her lips trembled as she stood up, her tears still falling. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice cracking under the weight of her emotions. He stepped closer, and for a moment she thought he might reach for her hand, but he didn't. Instead, he gave her a small, bittersweet smile. "We'll take it one step at a time," he said. And for the first time in months, she felt a glimmer of hope. It wasn't a guarantee, but it was a chance to fix what had been broken. And for now, that was enough. The walk back to her apartment felt lighter, though her mind remained a whirlpool of emotions. The cold wind nipped at her face, but this time, she welcomed it. Her heart was still fragile, but the weight of uncertainty had lifted, replaced by something she hadn't felt in months. Hope. His words echoed in her mind. "We'll take it one step at a time." It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a chance to rebuild what she had destroyed, to prove that she had learned from her mistakes. When she entered her apartment, the silence greeted her like an old companion, but it didn't feel as suffocating as before. She set her bag down on the table and glanced around at the sterile walls and lifeless decor. Daniel's presence was already fading from this place, even though his things were still scattered around. She didn't want them there anymore. She didn't want any reminder of the man who had been a symbol of her mistakes and betrayal. With a new sense of purpose, she grabbed a suitcase from the closet and began packing. Clothes, shoes, random keepsakes, all of it went into the suitcase without hesitation. As she packed, her phone vibrated on the counter. She glanced at the screen. A message from Daniel. "Let's talk." For a moment, she considered ignoring it, but something inside her compelled her to read it. She opened the message and felt a familiar sting of bitterness as she scanned the words. He wasn't apologizing. He wasn't asking for a second chance. Instead, it was a list of excuses, reasons why he thought she had overreacted, why she should give him another chance. There were no words of remorse, only blame subtly hidden beneath his charm. She closed the message without replying and tossed the phone onto the couch. She wasn't that woman anymore, the one who would cling to empty promises and sweet words that meant nothing. She was done chasing illusions. Tonight had reminded her of what real love looked like. Patient, quiet, and forgiving, even when it had every reason not to be. That was the love she had walked away from, and if she was lucky, she could earn it back. With her suitcase packed, she made a mental note to leave Daniel's apartment in the morning. She couldn't stay here any longer, surrounded by memories that reminded her of what she had lost. As she sat on the edge of the bed, she thought about how much she had taken for granted, the warmth of her ex-husband's presence, the stability he had provided, the way he had made her feel like she was enough without having to prove anything. She hadn't realized it back then, but now she saw the truth. The spark she had been searching for wasn't something you found in someone new. It was something you nurtured with the person who truly loved you. That night, for the first time in months, she slept without tears streaming down her face. Her dreams weren't haunted by regrets or what-ifs. Instead, she dreamed of new beginnings, of steps forward, of a life that could be repaired if she was willing to fight for it. The morning sunlight streamed through the window, warming her skin as she opened her eyes. Today would be the start of something new. She didn't know if her ex-husband would ever fully forgive her, but she was determined to show him that she wasn't the same woman who had walked out that door. After a quick shower and breakfast, she zipped up the suitcase and took one last look around the apartment. She didn't feel sadness or regret as she closed the door behind her. Instead, she felt a sense of closure. This chapter of her life was over, and it was time to start writing a new one. She hailed a cab and gave the driver her ex-husband's address, her fingers clutching the suitcase handle tightly. The ride was quiet, her mind playing out 1,000 scenarios of how the day might go. Would he be happy to see her? Would he regret offering her a second chance? The uncertainty gnawed at her, but she reminded herself of his words. One step at a time. When the cab pulled up in front of his house, she hesitated for a moment before stepping out. The sight of the familiar porch, the wind chimes gently swaying, calmed her nerves. This time, she wasn't here to beg or cry. She was here to take responsibility, to fight for the life she had almost destroyed. She approached the door and knocked softly, her heart thumping in her chest. When he opened the door, the warmth of his gaze immediately put her at ease. He didn't look surprised to see her, as if he had been expecting her all along. "You're early," he said with a small smile. "I couldn't wait," she replied, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "I'm ready," exactly where she belonged. This wasn't going to be easy. She knew that. There would be... He stepped aside, letting her in, and for the first time in a long time, she felt like she was difficult conversations, moments of doubt, and plenty of wounds to heal. But she was ready to face all of it. Because real love wasn't about avoiding the hard parts. It was about enduring them together. As she set her suitcase down by the door, he reached for her hand, and a wave of warmth spread through her. One step at a time, she thought, as she squeezed his hand gently. This was her second chance, and she wasn't going to waste it. Later that afternoon, They sat across from each other at the kitchen table, sunlight streaming through the window, casting soft golden hues over the room. The silence between them was no longer heavy. It felt like the calm after a storm, a moment to breathe before they began the difficult process of rebuilding. She watched him as he stirred his coffee, the familiar motion tugging at her heart. He hadn't changed much, but there was something different about the way he carried himself now. He seemed stronger, more sure of himself, as if he had spent the time apart growing in ways she hadn't expected. "I wasn't sure if you'd actually come back," he said, breaking the silence. His voice was gentle, but there was an undertone of vulnerability that hadn't been there before. He wasn't just stating a fact. He was admitting how deeply her return had affected him. "I wasn't sure if you'd let me," she replied, her fingers nervously tracing the rim of her coffee cup. "I didn't expect you to give me another chance. Not after what I did." He sighed, leaning back in his chair as he looked out the window. "You hurt me," he said, the honesty cutting through her like a knife. "But I don't think I ever stopped hoping you'd realize what we had." Her throat tightened, and she struggled to find the right words. "I realized it too late," she whispered, tears threatening to fall again. "I wish I could undo everything, but I know I can't. I can only show you that I'm different now." He studied her for a moment, as if searching for something. Sincerity, maybe, or proof that her words weren't just empty promises. "Why now?" he asked. "Why not a month ago or the day after you left him?" She swallowed hard, knowing this was the moment to be completely honest. "Because I wasn't ready to admit the truth to myself," she said, her voice shaking. "I was ashamed. I didn't want to face the fact that I had chosen wrong, that I had thrown away something real for an illusion. But when I saw you with her..." She paused, her breath hitching. "It hit me that I had lost you. I wasn't just afraid of being alone. I was afraid of never being able to make things right." He nodded slowly, his gaze softening. "The woman in the photo," he said, as if reading her mind. "She's a friend. She helped me get through some difficult days, but there's nothing romantic between us." Relief washed over her like a wave, but it was quickly followed by guilt. "I saw that photo and assumed the worst," she admitted. "It was selfish of me to think that way, especially after what I did to you." He reached across the table and placed his hand over hers, the warmth of his touch soothing her trembling fingers. "It wasn't selfish," he said. "It's human to feel that way. But you're here now, and that's what matters." Tears slipped down her cheeks, but this time they weren't tears of despair. They were tears of hope, of gratitude. "I know I can't fix this overnight," she said, "but I'm willing to do whatever it takes. I don't care how long it takes. I just want to earn your trust again." He squeezed her hand gently, and a small bittersweet smile crossed his lips. "I won't make it easy," he warned, but there was no bitterness in his tone. "But if you're willing to try, then so am I." She nodded, her heart swelling with determination. "I won't give up on us," she said firmly. "Not this time." As they sat there, their hands intertwined, the weight of the past didn't feel as heavy anymore. They weren't erasing their mistakes or pretending they hadn't happened. They were acknowledging them, accepting them as part of their story. And for the first time in what felt like forever, she felt like they had a future again. The sun continued to shine through the window, casting light on the new chapter they were about to begin. It wouldn't be perfect. There would be challenges, setbacks, and moments of doubt. But as she looked into his eyes, she knew that they had something stronger than regret, hope, resilience, and love worth fighting for. One step at a time, they would rebuild what had been broken piece by piece until they were whole again. And this time, she wouldn't take any of it for granted. The days that followed were not easy, but they were filled with purpose. They took things slowly, just as they had promised, but every step forward felt like a victory. She moved her things back into the house, one box at a time, carefully unpacking memories she had once thought she could leave behind. As she placed her books on the shelves and hung her clothes back in the closet, she realized how much she had missed the small, ordinary details of their life together. It wasn't the big, extravagant moments that she had been craving. It was the simple ones, the ones that felt like home. Their conversations were tentative at first, filled with cautious questions and thoughtful pauses. He didn't pretend that her betrayal hadn't hurt him, and she didn't ask for forgiveness overnight. They talked late into the night, sharing their fears and vulnerabilities, unraveling the emotions they had buried for so long. She told him about the emptiness she had felt even when she thought she was happy with Daniel, and he confessed how he had struggled to accept that she was gone. They cried together, but they also laughed, small, hesitant laughs that gradually grew louder and warmer. One evening, as they sat on the couch watching a movie, she rested her head on his shoulder, and he didn't pull away. It was a small gesture, but it meant everything to her. His warmth, his presence, it reminded her of what she had almost lost forever. "I missed this," she whispered, her fingers gently lacing through his. He didn't respond right away, but when he did, his voice was soft. "So did I." But not every moment was filled with warmth and comfort. There were days when the pain resurfaced, when he would pull away, lost in his thoughts. She knew it wasn't easy for him to forget the betrayal, and she didn't expect him to. There were moments when she could see the doubt flicker across his face, moments when he seemed unsure if rebuilding their relationship was worth the risk. Those moments terrified her, but instead of running from them, she faced them head-on. One afternoon, as they sat in the backyard, watching the autumn leaves scatter across the grass, he turned to her with a question that had been weighing on his mind. "What if I can't trust you the way I used to?" he asked, his voice steady, but filled with uncertainty. Her heart sank, but she didn't shy away from the truth. "Then I'll work every day to earn that trust back," she said, meeting his gaze. "I know it's not something I can just ask for. It's something I have to prove over time, but I'm willing to do whatever it takes." He nodded, seemingly satisfied with her answer, but the lingering doubt in his eyes told her that the road ahead would be long. She didn't mind. She had already lost him once, and she wasn't about to let it happen again. Slowly, but surely, they found their rhythm again. They went on small dates, walks in the park, coffee at their favourite cafe, dinners cooked together at home. They rebuilt their routines piece by piece, creating new memories while holding on to the best parts of the old ones. One evening, while sorting through a box of old photos, she came across their wedding album. She hesitated for a moment before flipping it open. The photos were filled with joy, her in her white dress, him in his suit, their friends and family surrounding them with smiles and laughter. Her fingers traced the edges of the photos as a wave of nostalgia washed over her. He sat down next to her, peering over her shoulder. "We were so young," he said with a soft chuckle. "We had no idea what we were getting into." She smiled, her eyes misty. "No, but we made it work for a long time." She hesitated before adding, "And I believe we can make it work again." He leaned in, gently kissing her forehead. "So do I." That night, as they lay in bed, she felt something shift between them, an unspoken understanding that they were finally on the same page. The pain hadn't disappeared, and it wouldn't for a while, but they were healing. Together. As she drifted off to sleep, wrapped in his arms, she realized that second chances weren't just about fixing the past. They were about building something stronger, something that could withstand the storms they had once let tear them apart. And this time, she knew she would hold on to him with everything she had, because love wasn't about finding perfection. It was about embracing the imperfections and choosing each other over and over again. And that was exactly what she intended to do. Months passed, and the rhythm of their lives slowly returned to something that resembled normalcy. But it was different this time. Better in ways she hadn't anticipated. They communicated more openly, no longer hiding their fears or doubts. When something bothered them, they talked about it, even if the conversations were difficult. Trust wasn't something that magically reappeared. It was built brick by brick through effort, vulnerability, and honesty. Some days they took giant leaps forward. Other days they stumbled and had to catch their balance, but they always kept moving forward. One evening they sat on the porch together, a light breeze rustling the leaves around them. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. She leaned against him, her head resting on his shoulder as they watched the world quietly change around them. The peace of the moment reminded her of the simpler days, the ones she had once considered mundane but now cherished deeply. "I've been thinking," she said softly, breaking the silence, "about how much I took you for granted." He didn't respond immediately, but she felt the way his fingers gently squeezed hers. "I've been thinking about how I could have done better too," he replied. "I know you blamed yourself, but I wasn't perfect either. I didn't see the signs. I didn't realize how much you were hurting." Her heart swelled with a mixture of sadness and gratitude. "It wasn't your fault," she whispered. "I made my choices. I was searching for something that was right here all along." He turned to face her, his gaze soft but serious. "We both made mistakes," he said, "but the fact that we're here now means we're doing something right." She smiled through her tears. "I'm so grateful for this second chance," she said. "I don't think I would have survived without it." He wiped a tear from her cheek, his touch gentle. "I wouldn't have either," he admitted. "There were days I thought I'd never see you again." She leaned into him, their foreheads gently touching. "You don't have to worry about that anymore," she said. "I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." The moment felt sacred, a quiet promise exchanged between them. As the sky darkened and the stars began to appear, they stayed on the porch, holding hands, knowing that they had weathered the storm and were stronger because of it. The wounds weren't completely healed, but they were healing, and that was enough. The following weekend, they took a short trip to a cabin by the lake, a place they used to visit when they first got married. The air was crisp, and the lake reflected the clear blue sky. They spent the days hiking, cooking together, and reliving memories of their early days while creating new ones. It was simple, but that simplicity was what made it perfect. On the last night of the trip, they sat by the fire, a blanket wrapped around their shoulders as they sipped hot cocoa. The crackling flames danced in their eyes, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Then he broke the silence. "I never asked," he said, "but what was the moment you knew you wanted to come back?" She stared into the fire, the memory vivid in her mind. "It wasn't just one moment," she admitted. "It was a series of them. Nights when I couldn't sleep, moments when I missed the sound of your voice, times when I realized that no one else could ever make me feel the way you did." She paused, her voice softening. "But if I had to choose one moment, it was when I saw that photo of you at the cafe. The caption, the way you looked so peaceful, it broke me. I realized you had moved on, or at least that you were trying to, and it made me see how much I had truly lost." He listened, his gaze never leaving hers. I wasn't as peaceful as I looked in that photo, he confessed. I was putting on a brave face, but every day without you felt like something was missing. She reached for his hand, interlacing their fingers. I don't want us to ever feel that way again, she said. I want to be the person you can depend on, the one who stands by you, no matter how hard things get. You are, he replied, his voice steady. You've always been that person. We just lost our way for a while. They sat there, the fire crackling softly beside them, and she realized that the fear of losing him had finally been replaced by the certainty of having him back. They had been tested, broken, and scarred, but they had survived. Their love wasn't perfect, and it never would be, but it was real. It was resilient, and most importantly, it was theirs. As the night deepened, they sat in comfortable silence, the stars above them twinkling like tiny reminders of the beauty in imperfection. She rested her head on his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart, a sound she had once taken for granted, but now cherished with every fibre of her being. And as the fire slowly died down, she closed her eyes, knowing that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. Because love, she realized, wasn't just about finding the right person. It was about choosing that person over and over again, even when the world tried to pull them apart. And this time, she was never letting go.